Good morning. It's good to be back with you guys. It's been a while. And I want to congratulate you on completing your recent call and starting on a new journey. It kind of fits with Advent that we're going to be going into. But before we jump the gun, we're not in Advent yet. We're still in the end of the church year. And so I want to focus on that phrase I talked about, which is, know not what we are doing. Jesus begs his Father to forgive those, for they do not know what they are doing. And yet that's kind of hard to swallow. Not that Jesus will forgive, but that the people didn't know what they were doing. The Roman soldiers who were crucifying Jesus knew that the reason that you crucify is because somebody opposed the power of Rome. Crucifixion was held as a punishment for those who were fighting against the power of Rome. It was such a terrible punishment, and humiliation to lie up on that cross for hours and hours and hours. It was meant to intimidate anybody else that might have the idea, I'm going to oppose the power of Rome. And so, all right, the Roman soldiers might not have known that they were crucifying the Son of God, but they knew that he was crucifying an innocent man. He didn't mount a rebellion. Jesus never did anything to raise up the Jewish people against their overlords, the Romans. So who else are they talking about? Who's the gospel writer referring to? Is it the leaders that conspired to get the Romans to respond in this way? Is it the mass of people who shouted, crucify him? That phrase of forgive for they do not know what they're doing is a Lucan phrase. From the Gospel of Luke, he also wrote the book of Acts, and we'll find that same phrase with the death of the first Christian martyr, Stephen. He will ask God to forgive those who are stoning him to death, for they do not know what they're doing. Sometimes I would suggest that we intentionally do not know what we are doing. It's easier to not know so that we can claim we don't need to act. Or we hide behind that line, I don't know. I didn't know. I didn't understand these terrible things were going on. How could I possibly have acted? It's the argument that prisoners often make. It's the arguments that war criminals always make. I was simply doing my job. I didn't know. So you can't hold me guilty. A dozen years ago, I focused my ministry full time on environmental justice, so I'm going to take us into that. What we willingly do not know, so we don't have to act. In my youth, well, actually in my parents' generation, rivers were looked fondly upon because they would take your waste away. Right? So you could dump your waste, your pollution, in a river, and it would flush it down. But whoever lived downstream would have to pay for that, but you got rid of it. So what was wrong with that? In fact, the people in Chicago took it to the next level. They reversed the direction of the river so that it wouldn't spoil their lakefront. And they put all their pollution down southern Illinois. Who cares about those people? I grew up in the city of Cleveland, which was a heavy industrialized city, and we had a principal river called the Cuyahoga. The Cuyahoga River ran right through the middle of Cleveland, dividing it into a west side and an east side, but it ran right past the steel mills. And it was so heavily polluted that it caught on fire 3 times in my youth. 3 times. Not once, but a river catching on fire 3 times. Because there's more oil and gas and waste than it was water and life. And the same was true of the lakefront in Cleveland. Lake Erie was actually declared dead at one point in time because the oxygen was all gone and couldn't sustain population. But in the 60s and in the 70s, the people finally said, we can see this. We know this. We have to do something about this. And so we created a number of laws that we passed that started to regulate what you could put into water and what you could put into air and what you could put into land. And the neat thing about rivers is because they flow, they can rapidly recover once you shut off the pollution that are going into them. And so the Cuyahoga boom back right now, there's a national park on the Cuyahoga River. I could never have imagined that when I was young. Lake Erie is booming as a walleye capital and perch fishing and watercrafts. I remember in my youth, there used to be a tourist boat called the Good Times 2, which means there had to have been a Good Times 1. And it would go along the lakefront, and as a school kid, we'd go out on the excursions on it. And you go up the Cuyahoga River, and you pass Harshaw Chemical Plant, and Harshaw Chemical Plant did sulfur chemicals. And if the wind was in the right direction, all the passengers that paid good money to be on this boat would be leaning over the rails puking because the smell from the sulfur got to you. I always thought that was funny. People would pay good money to go on a tourist boat in order to throw up. But we regulated this. In true confessions, in my earlier life, I was an engineer in the chemical industry. In fact, I was a plant manager of highly hazardous chemicals. And when all these environmental rules were being passed in the 70s and 80s, I bemoaned, just like all the other people who were in the chemical industry, these regulations that were coming down that were just profiting lawyers and putting the rest of us out of work. But they made us better. They made us better by having to tighten up what we could put into the water and into the air and into the ground. We had to tighten up how we made stuff. And when we did that, we improved not only the yield, we had less waste going out because waste was very expensive then, but we improved our quality, we improved our productivity, we improved our performance. And so oddly enough, these environmental laws that we protested actually benefited us. In our short-sightedness, we didn't see it at one time when they were passed, but along the way, if you invested in your processes, you became better at what you did. But a lot of industry didn't do that. A lot of industry took the easy way out, which is what? They moved their manufacturing overseas to countries that didn't have these kind of regulations. And so they could pollute whatever they wanted to. They didn't have to spend money on scrubbers or on confinement plants or on tightening up their systems. They could just pollute. But we're not off the hook here because we let them do it. We kept buying their goods. Even though they were polluting and ruining the land and the water and the air on the other side of the oceans, we kept buying their goods because, well, they were cheaper. And so we could have cheap electronics, we could have cheap TVs, we could have cheap appliances, we could have cheap, everything cheap, as long as we didn't know or look closer that they were destroying the land, the water, and the air where they were at. So we chose not to know. Forgive them, for they do not know what they do. In the chemical industry, particularly in the hazardous chemical industry, I had what I call friendly chemicals. And what are friendly hazardous chemicals? Those are chemicals that are so obnoxious that you won't willingly stay there. If there's a leak, you won't willingly stay in the presence of that chemical, like ammonia or chlorine. That'll just drive you out. But I also had hazardous chemicals, very hazardous chemicals, that were pleasant to smell. And so you'd be willing to stay in them because, well, they smelled like new mown hay, phosgene gas. Or they smelled sweet. And so as a plant manager, what I had to do was educate so that my employees would know that even though this stuff smelled good, it was bad. And you had to shut down and seal up whatever leaks you might have. You had to know. But personal protective equipment was difficult to wear, particularly in the summer when you're sweating, to wear a gas mask and the rubber suits and the gloves and all that. And so I had to take it to the next level. Not only did you have to know that the chemicals were no good for you, you had to know that if I found you doing that, we would call you formerly employed by. You have to know. Why do I raise all this? Well, the Cuyahoga River has recovered. So Lake Erie has recovered. The Detroit River, where I had my industrial career, has recovered. The Fox River, where I live right now, has recovered. They've all recovered as long as you don't muck up the bottom, right? Because if you scrape in the bottom, the pollution is down in that soil. But if we don't know about it, then we don't worry about it, right? But we've reached a different level. 250 years ago, we decided it'd be a good idea to burn oil and coal and gas, fossil fuels, 250 years ago, starting off with coal. And there was a good idea because you got immense energy payback for a little bit of burning oil, coal, and gas. The Industrial Revolution was born. But about 150 years ago, really 150 years ago, scientists calculated this is not good. When we burn coal and oil and gas, we're contaminating the atmosphere. We're increasing the density of the atmosphere, and we're trapping heat. And when you trap heat, bad things happen. But it's out of sight, out of mind. We don't really know. I mean, we've cleaned up so the smokestacks are no longer black. So what's it mean that this burning of oil and coal and gas is hurting us? I mean, look at the exhaust pipes on our cars. They're putting out, most of the time you can't even see they're putting something out, right? We've cleaned that up. Why would we want to know that we're destroying the earth by heating it up? It's kind of easy to turn our heads away from that and say we just don't know, do we? It's just conjecture, right? It's just sometimes it's saying some stuff. Back in the mid-1950s, scientists grew so concerned about this that they permanently established on Hawaii a station to send a balloon up into the atmosphere and measure the carbon dioxide that we were increasing, that we were putting up. And you chose Hawaii because it was the less polluted place around. And if you go back and you look at the charts, you see a steady increase going up. 27 years ago, now I'm getting ahead, in the 1980s, the first time climate scientists testified before Congress, climate change is real, and it's happening now. 40 years ago. 40 years ago. 27 years ago, the first time the parties, the Conference of the Parties, where every nation across the globe gathered together people and sent to a conference held place. And what were they to deal with? They were to deal with this concept of global warming, that we are going to destroy civilization. We're going to destroy the life systems of the planet unless we change our way. 27 years ago. 7 years ago, I was in Paris for COP21. And it was the first time that all the nations of the earth agreed that climate change is real. It's happening now. And if we don't change our way, humanity is going to suffer tremendously. The numbers keep going up. Last night, the 27th Conference of the Parties finally wrapped up in Egypt. And they didn't come up with a plan to stop this constant rise. They just say we need to. But nobody agreed on how to stop this constant rise. They did reach one stunning agreement, which is that the rich nations of the world have a responsibility to compensate the poor nations who are going to suffer the first and the most from the climate crisis. They didn't decide how we were going to do that. They didn't decide who has to do it, how much. They just decided to set up a fund, and they would talk over the next couple of years. But we don't know what we're doing, so we ought to be forgiven for not acting, right? There are two bookends, scriptural bookends to my ministry. In my later life, I keep coming back to these and focus on them. The first is the opening passage of Genesis, where the poet that gave us the opening passages of Genesis says that God, every day, when God finished up creation for that day, said, this is good. So on day 2, this is good. On day 3, God looks upon what God had created and said, this is good. On day 4, this is good. On day 5, this is good. On day 6, when God, as expressed in Genesis, was finished with creation, that's oddly enough when human beings were introduced, God said, this is very good. Do we act? We can see the effects now. It's getting very hard to deny it's happening. The size of the storms. We've had to make new categories for storms and for droughts and for heat waves. If you look at temperature maps and rainfall maps and flood maps and drought maps, they've all added another color because what we had is no longer what we have. But we don't know, right? We don't know. The other scriptural bookend that guides my ministry is the Gospels, where somebody goes up to Jesus and says, good teacher, what's the most important thing? What is the most important thing I can do in this life? What is the one thing I can do in this life that God would have me do? And Jesus says, you know, it's been in the scriptures since the beginning. Love God, love neighbor, love self. You can't love God if we're destroying God's good creation. You can't love God if we don't love our neighbor. The neighbor that is suffering from the floods. The neighbor that is suffering, even on the other side of the world, because we changed the weather patterns and now they live in drought. And so they're starving. You can't love the neighbor and not feel the pain of those who are driven out of their homes by the forest fires, which are now every day of the year. We have made places of the earth uninhabitable. We can claim we didn't know, but we knew. This migration crisis that everybody is upset about, this concept of people that are willing to risk the lives of themselves and their families to come here, they're not doing it because they want to mow our lawns. They're doing it because their kids are dying where they're at, because it's no longer habitable. 10,000 people have drowned in the Mediterranean trying to escape Africa to find a place where they could live. You don't take on that kind of risk if you had any other choice. But our concept, since we don't know that we're causing this, is we're going to put up walls. We're going to restrict the flow of human beings, of God's children. We're going to separate families to keep them from coming here. Forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. Jesus may well forgive us for destroying God's good creation. I don't know. One thing I'm very confident of is that our kids and our grandkids won't forgive us. We have 10 years to stop this rise before the cost gets so horrendous we won't be able to bear the sight of the suffering. Do we stay in our willful ignorance? Or do we stop burning the oil and the coal and the gas? If you go to my website, sustainingcreation.org, you'll find lots of resources on there, including 48 action steps that you can take if you want to get involved in this. 48! Don't worry about it. Here's 2. Remember the first scripture? Woe to you that lead my people astray. First thing, talk about it. Let's bring the unknowable, what we call the unknowable, into our everyday conversation. And say, this is getting to be way too an expensive cost in human tragedy to avoid dealing with anymore. So just in normal conversation over the backyard fence, well, in the summer over the backyard fence. Today, maybe in the coffee hour. That when we bring this into our public discourse, into our everyday, ordinary conversations, we make it known. We make it known. I used to give presentations with 400, 500, 600 slides so that I could convince you by the science of what was happening, and I realized that it wasn't working. Because if you choose not to know, you won't know. What works, the only thing I know that works, is when somebody encounters someone who cares. And they share that concern, that for the sake of my grandkids, we got to do something about this. We got to do something about this. So that's 1. Talk with those that you know. When they see someone that they trust raise this concern, they'll wonder if they shouldn't be also. What's number 2? Tell your congressperson that we know that we have to change. For the sake of our kids and our grandkids, for the sake of all of God's children, for the sake of all of God's good creation, we have to make the unknowable known so that we can act and we can decide. I want to close with a benediction from St. Francis. May God bless you with discomfort. Add easy answers, half-truths, superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger. Add injustice, oppression, exploitation of people, so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, hunger, and war, so you may reach out your hand to comfort them and to turn their pain into joy. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in the world, so that you can do what others claim cannot be done, to bring justice and kindness to all our children and the poor. May this day we make the unknowable known, and may we act on that. Amen.